Hello, everybody. Hey, gang. So I'm Stan Mitchell. I hail from Nashville, Tennessee, not Asheville, Nashville. And I host this tent. I'm glad you came. You heard that I was doing this. I host this tent to introduce the church to new authors and new preachers. So you're in luck. So I'm going to get out of the way, and I'm going to pitch as many underhanded pitches as I can to this lady who is one of mine and a lot of our muses and literary pastors and guides and heroes, really. How did I get the job of interviewing her? I haven't told her. We're staying next door to one another, but I grew up in Northeast Arkansas, fifth generation Pentecostal, very fundamentalist, long time in that world. My dad was one of 15 kids, only one with a high school degree. I'm one of 42 first cousins who all stayed in the same town. I escaped. There was an underground railroad where I got out to Nashville. Of the 42 of us, maybe a handful of college degrees, but a wonderful group of sincere people doing their best with the exposure that they had. So much depends on exposure. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. said, "A mind once exposed to a better idea can never shrink to its original size." And so I was the quintessential 16-year-old kid with a little precociousness and energy and sincerity that was conscripted into ministry. And I began preaching at 16 and was carrying the party line as hard as I could. And as grace would have it, a United Methodist pastor moved in next door. And his wife was someone that I had a lot of conversation with, was doing my best to convert her. And one day she slipped me a little white book. This was 1984. She slipped me a little white book. And it was the first of Max Lucado's book. Remember those days? On the Anvil. He wrote it as a young missionary in Rio de Janeiro. I put the book under my bed. It was the closest thing that a young Pentecostal preacher could have to a Playboy. So I put it under the bed because it was literally, in our movement, it was contraband. Young ministers were not allowed to read what was called external literature. And I hid it under the bed and eventually pulled it out from under the bed and read this book and was scandalized behind the iron wall of our faith that a Church of Christ, a non-fiddle playing Campbellite, we called them, could speak so eloquently to the life of Jesus. And I learned something by happenstance in those days that I don't know how I learned it, but maybe it was within the breeding of our own religion. I realized that, especially for evangelical people, if you want to know what they believe, don't read what they write, read who they read. And Lucado led me to Swindoll, and Swindoll led me to Yancey, and once I got to Yancey, it was exponential. Because when I got to Yancey, I found not just Lewis and Indo and Tolstoy, but I found Nouwen and L'Engle. And this is a young Pentecostal preacher in an exclusivistic denomination under the cover of night, like Nicodemus under that sycamore tree with the Judean moon shining down through the branches. I would huddle with my books and I would read Buechner. And I found Brendan and Godric and the books of Bebb and Telling Secrets and Now and Then and Sacred Journey, an Alphabet of Grace, and that young Pentecostal preachers. The scandal became an opening of heart. And the poetic prose of Frederick Buechner, as one who fancied himself an amateur grammarian and loved syntax and vocabulary, Buechner drew me in. And in the nuance of his writings, that incredibly poetic prose where he could turn a run-on sentence into a full paragraph and still make sense, I found life. And I literally, and of course from Buechner, I found Tillich and Niebuhr and Union, and on the backside of nowhere as a young fundamentalist kid with a decent enough brain and an open heart, I literally bibliographied my way upstream with literary pastors. And at some point in that journey, I I was talking to someone who was also a lover of all things Buechner. And they said, have you heard of Barbara Brown Taylor? And I said, I don't think so. And they said, just read her. She does not imitate or approximate Buechner exactly, but she is the same in terms of beauty and the ability to take syntax and prose and make it so poetic that it weaves and provides the opening of heart for good theology. And I found her, and as much as Buechner now and changed my life, she did too. So she didn't know that, but when I'm one of the fortunate ones, I think I just told the story of about 80% of the people in the room, but I'm one of the fortunate ones. Jeff Clark, who's the president of the Wild Goose and is a wonderful guy if you haven't met him. Jeff, if you don't know what his life is back home, he lives in Nashville. He's been a professor at MTSU for 32 years. He's probably the most published this guy you see dancing and being crazy out here. It's amazing to me that he does this almost as a volunteer. He's probably the most published professor in any discipline at MTSU. I'm really lucky because he's a dear friend of mine. He's a member of our church. And just to show you the underside of these people's life, he's a board member at our church, and he's really just one of the greatest parishioners and board members that I have. And when we were going over the schedule and he was talking about trying to get this person, I said, well, whatever you do, let me interview her. So that was pastoral privilege involved in this. So I suppose the best thing you can do is not, this is not NPR, and I'm not Krista Tippett, who's just a genius at this kind of thing.
You have to flip.
Yeah, you have to flip your hair to be Kristen. Which she's a hero too. She's incredible. But I suppose I could just throw you the underhanded pitch of telling you we would love to know what's lighting you up these days. I know you're writing another book, thank God. I was just talking to Brian McLaren about writing another book because he's changed my life too. And he said, I'm just looking for something to turn my heart, because something has to turn your heart. What's turning your heart and what's moving you these days, and what are you and Ed doing in North Georgia on the farm? Oh, Barbara Brown Taylor, everyone.
I just want to listen to him talk about me. I
can do that.
No. Aren't we all going to go home and do the family tree of our reading? I mean, how did we get where we are? I mean, what an incredible thing to go home and think about. Who did I read? Who led me to, on and on and on. So thank you. I think this is not just to romance you, but this kind of thing is what's lighting things up for me right now. I decided for a lot of reasons last May to step back from teaching college for a lot earlier than I thought I would. So that freed up time. Everybody who loved me said, you need to have a plan. And I said, no, the plan is to have no plan. But it did mean I'm not in the classroom every Tuesday and Thursday and grading midterms, et cetera, et cetera. So I've started saying yes to unexpected invitations. I think it was Kurt Vonnegut who said, odd travel suggestions are dancing lessons from God. And I've taken that same kind of idea to some invitations I've gotten to travel. So I'm having a good time doing things I don't know how to do this year. And it means my anxiety level's really high. And when it's all over, I'm really happy.
So tell them about the new book. I think the new book, I read a little bit about it online before you and I talked, but Holy Envy, which isn't coming out for, I suppose, another 6 months or so. But
no, all you aspiring writers, you turn it in on April 1st and it comes out March 19th of the next year. So there's a long queue. I'm calling the book Holy Envy, and that's a tip of the hat to Krister Stendahl, who was for a while dean at Harvard Divinity School, went on to Stockholm. Short story is a new Mormon temple was opening up in Stockholm, and people figured he'd be a likely fellow to help them oppose that. And instead, he went up to the microphone and proposed 3 rules of religious understanding. The first was, if you want to learn about another religion, learn from its adherents and not its critics. And the second rule was, don't compare your best to their worst. And the third one was practice holy envy. And I don't think anybody ever figured out what that meant. We just liked the way it sounded so much. I ended up, after leaving parish ministry in 1998, moving after about a 3-month spell in the desert to college, 6 miles from where I already lived, and I taught world religions more often than any other course for the next 20 years. So Holy Envy is about the experience of a small college classroom. When I look at the people who are sitting here before me, I am not Stephen Prothero, and I'm not Diana Eck, and I'm not Karen Armstrong. I'm not a ton of people, but I did teach world religion to 30 undergraduates at a time in a little church-related college in rural Georgia, and I thought there was a story to tell about that. It ended up being as much about the teacher as it was about the students, but that's what's coming out next March. So I will see how it goes.
Were the kids who matriculate to Piedmont, are they just rural, evangelical North Georgia kids that are scandalized by your teaching, or?
Oh, but that makes your classes go up. If you,
Is that right?
Yeah, the more scandalous you are. I'm halfway teasing. Over 20 years, that changed a lot. You're asking me questions, but I'm going to look at them too.
Yeah, please.
Okay. When I first came, Piedmont was a place where a good part of the student body were the first in their families to go to college. So it was a really interesting place for the daughter of a college professor to be. And I don't have a PhD, so I was sort of not supposed to be there. But I can do 101 of anything and do it all the time. It has changed a lot since then. University of Georgia is about an hour and 15 minutes away. And Piedmont was, at that time, President Mellenchamp, forgive me if you ever see this, but it was about a fourth choice school. If you were the child of a Congregationalist minister, you came for free because it's a church-affiliated school from 1897. But these days, it's a first-choice school, especially if you like to kayak or hike or want your professors to know you by name and go over to their house for dinner on Sunday night, because we limit classes to 25 per class. So now it's a first-choice college. Tuition hasn't gone up, enough to rule out the students I first knew. But what a precious way to spend a couple of decades. I had a great time.
Could you give us a story? I mean, obviously you have hundreds and the book is filled with them. A story about Holy Envy and your kids that could kind of pique our interest for the book.
Well, as I was telling you before we started, he was asking me about textbooks. And it's the craziest thing in the world. To teach 5 major world religions in 15 weeks, do the math. You meet twice a week. To teach your own as part of that, and for anybody to think you could teach the others without having spent as much time in them as you did in your own. But choosing a textbook just turned out to be kind of a hopeless enterprise, because you couldn't learn about the great religions of the world by reading a textbook any more than you could how to be a great chef by eating a cookbook. I mean, it just didn't work. You had to go out and meet people. So Atlanta, Georgia has a community that represents every tradition I know of in the world now. So we would get in the van and head south to Atlanta. And that's where all kinds of things happened. What I loved were the one-page reflection papers I would read when I got home by people who were so anxious about going on these trips. And ironically, a lot of them were anxious because they came out of Christian traditions that had a lot of evangelism in them, which meant they assumed everywhere we went, people were going to try to convince them to give up their religion and become whatever we were visiting. And it was just the biggest shock in the world. One young man whose story I tell in the book is Brian. We were at Drepung Losaling Tibetan Buddhist monastery in Atlanta, and we went in and sat on our zafus, and the teacher started talking, and Brian turned around. I was only about 2 rows behind him. I was not on a cushion, and he mouthed to me, I'll say this much louder than he did, he said, "This is just about life." And at that moment, I think he had a spot of holy envy, but I had a huge spot of holy envy. Because when I talk just about life, in some churches, I'm called like a secular humanist. Or there's some idea that I have to be talking about religion, that if I'm just talking about life, Jesus isn't interested in that. So I think that was both a moment for him and a moment for me of a wake up, a wonderful wake up, that we were in a place where people wanted to talk about life and had no interest in turning my students into anything else. I could keep going on these stories a long time. I just thought of 9 more. Go ahead.
So obviously, I mean, the big deal about you is you're like one of the great preachers in America. I've wanted to ask you personally, just thinking about, the mainline church and now all of us post-evangelicals, we work so hard on the wine of theology and ideas. I think now all of us are beginning to reflect, looking at our empty churches and some of the struggles we have. Have we done as well keeping the wineskin up with the wine? Is this medium through which we convey holiness, is it as good as the message that we feel like we have, this beautiful gospel? What is preaching, and where does preaching fit in the next 100 years of what we call the church?
Would anyone like to answer that question? First of all, I learned this from Bill Leonard. He said his mother used to look at preachers and say, if he don't sweat, I don't listen. I wish I knew. I have, the only sense I have, I can see about 2 inches ahead of where we are right now. I met with some seminarians on Thursday, and one said, I'm thinking about ordination, but I'm anxious because I don't know where the church will be when I graduate from seminary. And I said, how long is that? She said, 2 years. And I think she's right. I mean, I think that's where things are, so I just cannot read the future. I do know, as you probably do, that monologues now seem to me, unless it's on, like, the Moth Radio Hour, or I do listen to a whole series of Saturday talk shows of people telling their stories, so I know narrative is not over, but I do wonder if the monologue in church is going to be reserved more and more and more for people who really put a lot of time into it and love to do it. I just don't know where it's going. Will you answer this?
You're one of the 10 best preachers.
But I didn't do that on purpose. It's a race I didn't enter.
There are so many preachers languishing just listening to this because we've invested so much into that trade.
Yeah.
And now it's beginning to feel somewhat hollow and ineffectual. And we wonder, can we transfer this skill? Do we need to transfer it fully? Is there ways that it can be appropriated where we're still doing proclamation and instruction and inspiration? And you're one of the best at it, so I just thought you'd have a lot better answer than that.
I'm going to ask him, okay, in just a minute. Well, Jackie Lewis this morning, didn't she tell us we were all preachers? So I sure do like to think that whatever skills would make someone, and I do like effective. Effective is a decent adjective instead of great or good or something. But I do like to think the same skills, love of language, love of imagination, love of transformational narrative, ability to relate to people. You've even got to have kind of a way of being in your body to be a decent proclaimer, I think. But I like to think all those things would transfer over to a lot of other aspects of should I say ordained ministry? But see, she said we're all ministers. So I really do hope these are transferable, portable skills, whatever direction it goes in. And I think there's always going to be room for the great orators. I mean, we have a little proof of that on the main stage every morning, that there's still a lot of room for orators who can really take a microphone for a good long time and you're transfixed.
So let's go to content. 2 things I wanted to ask. Holy Envy is the new book. And I don't want to be so esoteric that it's not achievable, but what is the holy? I mean, An Altar in the World was one of the books that really began to kind of alter my view of that idea. Otto's Numinous and An Altar in the World and several others. But what is the holy? And then in terms of the proclamation of the gospel, to you, what is the synopsis of the gospel? So let's start with holy. What is the holy?
This isn't going to help. This is going to be a succession of bad answers, okay?
Good.
But I'm widely lauded for my honesty. I don't know. But I'm reading a lot of Howard Thurman right now, and what I love about him is his insistence on a direct experience of the divine. Now, I don't know anybody who asked him a lot of questions about that. How do you vet that? How do I know if you're psychotic or a mystic or on a... But he when he co-created Fellowship Church in San Francisco, he really diminished dogma and doctrine and the ways that denominations do things, and he really put up the idea of direct experience of God and fellowship and community with people who are not particularly like you. He would have loved Wild Goose. He would have loved Wild Goose. So I'm finding him really helpful, though I'm no better. He may have been better at it. I may not have read the right book yet at defining what that is. But there is a sense in which I'm way more interested in hearing about your experience of the holy than I am in telling you whether it was or wasn't. Did it? That all I would do then is find out how much you and I are alike, which gets to your next question about gospel. I've always been told preachers just preach the same sermon over and over again, in which case they're preaching, every one of you is preaching the story that got you. What's the net that settled over your head and shoulders so that you were one of the people that the fishers caught. And it hasn't changed much for me, and it is about a word, because of this morning, I'm not going to use much anymore, which is inclusion. And it's just because of, well, now what am I going to do? The democratization of the community of God, because just where I grew up, Tuscaloosa, Alabama in the 60s, and a place where there was not a lot of anything. Good grief. I think I still remember segregated swimming pools. I know Ed, my husband, remembers segregated movie theaters where you got different tickets at the front. So at any rate, when I became overtly Christian at 16, and then several times after that, it was always the inclusion, a re-inclusion, a wider definition of a bigger table with more chairs at it. So that one I never get tired of, and when people tell me I could preach that without a Bible, it still seems to me that's one where the old story is a timeless one.
And the old story is what?
Oh, well. Okay, can I ask you questions, or is this you asking me questions? Okay. Well, the old story... Again, he's nailing me here, because not only are we not going to agree, especially on the story that got us, but if someone said to you, do you believe the gospel? I would just love to stop right now and make you all write the gospel down on an index card. What is it? Because again, I don't think we're going to have a perfect match on this. But the Hebrew Bible, First Testament, in some ways is a collection of stories I like even better, because people are so weird. Who said that? Are just so odd. Yeah, and in the New Testament, it's like everybody got better behaved all of a sudden, or the editors were a little more strict or something. Because, people just behave better generally. But it seems to me that because I look through, again this morning, my biblical hermeneutic is to look for where the boundaries are. Where are the boundaries? Where are the boundaries moving? Who established the boundaries? Of what do the boundaries consist? Who's arguing with what boundary? What happens to the people who argue with the boundaries? That's interesting to me. That's life-saving to me. It's life-threatening to me, too, is moving the boundaries around.
I like that. So I do want to do this. Sometime when I'm in these situations, I look out and I see people, and this is maybe against democratization, but other of my heroes and some of your counterparts that have changed a lot of our lives are out here, and I see Peggy and Tony Campolo over here. I would love for y'all to be thinking of a question that you would have for Barbara Brown Taylor. Could there be anything better than a question from Tony and Peggy Campolo? Isn't that right? So that's good. So y'all be thinking about a question you have for her. I've always wanted to say this to an author. Are all of your... do you guys remember like Buck and Dottie Rambo from the old gospel music days? Buck came to our church in the last years of his life, and he said of Dottie, who was one of the most prolific Southern gospel songwriters, he said she never knew the difference between her great songs and her bad songs. He said every song was like a child to her, and she loved the ugly ones as much as she loved the pretty ones. That's awful. That was bad. I should have come up with a better analogy, but that's what he said. I know you don't have any ugly books, but does your idea, do you have a favorite book that was a turning point for you? Maybe not just the you did the best at that book, but that was such a pivotal book for you, or was every book equally a born-again experience and pivotal for you? That's an easy question. On your website, you say you're the one that talks about difficult things and doesn't care.
That's a new website, though. I haven't practiced a lot, okay?
I'm trying to give easy. I thought that was an easy one. Come on.
No, I think you're asking me a question. Leaving Church was a pivotal book, and it was for a couple reasons. One was, that means you read it. You can't believe how many people wouldn't read it because of the title. And I said 3/4 of it is about being in love with church. So, read the thing. But it was pivotal for a couple reasons. One was that the books I'd published previously were with a small Episcopal press in Cambridge that stopped publishing books. And during that same period of I couldn't go back to the well I had gone to, I also decided to leave full-time parish ministry and move to the college. And a silence fell over me for a good 4 or 5 years. And I didn't know how to come back as a writer. But when I came back, I was introduced to a literary agent. I pitched him some ideas. Leaving Church, that transition was one of them. I had a great book on Job I wanted to write, some others. And he said, these are terrible, except for the one on Leaving Church. So in a way, it was a huge transition. Go from a little Episcopal house to Harper One, then Harper San Francisco. But also, that was a real coming out of a literary closet to go from being a preacher who spoke in terms of we believe and we are called to, and let us now say the Nicene Creed. I know you don't all do that, but I had to go, I decided had to go to first person pronouns because that was all I could be sure of anymore, which made me a memoirist, which made me just like fodder for voyeurism and narcissism. And it was just a really hard book to write because I wanted to be the hero of it. And everybody else in it kept saying, no, you're not the hero of this book. You're a character in it. But it was a very difficult kind of looking in the mirror long enough to get a book out. I now wish I'd waited one more year because I was still hurt when I wrote it. And if any of you read it, I was still hurt. So it was the first time I was trying that kind of book. I was still hurt, and I'd like to have let that one steep for another. So that's my ugly child.
That's your ugly child? I thought the whole time you were talking about your beautiful child. Tony, Peggy, are you close?
I thought you were on an airplane already. I heard you talking about this earlier. I'm reading yours and Bart's book right now. It really belongs to all three of you. Go ahead.
We can't hear you. You want to come up here?
Come up here, Tony. We can tell somebody and somebody can tell us.
Oh, he's going to talk. Okay, go ahead. Can y'all hear him over here? Yes. Hey, can you come up here?
It's Peggy.
He's going to talk for Peggy, like he always does. Thanks for doing this. So you're a harbinger of Peggy's question. Good.
When William Sloane Coffin's son was killed, at the funeral service, the preacher said, we must accept this as the will of God and that God is in control. William Sloane Coffin stood up and shouted in the middle of his son's funeral service, the hell, it's God's plan. When my son died, God was the first one that cried. I find that so many young people have a hard time dealing with the fact that a common statement around the church is, God is in control, God is in control, God is in control. Is God in control?
Another underhanded pitch.
It's interesting we don't talk about that more, although it's shown up right away in the book that I'm reading. Okay, we're talking about divine sovereignty. we're talking about whether everything that happens by the will of God. I hate to cheat with prepositions, but I like everything that happens within God. And because I'm Christian, I believe that the worst things that can happen can yield new life even if I'm not alive to see it. Sometimes I think we've got an individual frame and forget we're part of a community, so that my tragedy may sow the seeds for someone else's bridge later, unless a seed falls to the earth. But I have found a great help from Jewish theologians, friends, and also from Dorothy Sirla of blessed memory, who talked a lot about this and ended up with the picture of Jesus on the cross, whom it is said he could have asked for the angels to come rescue him, and they would have. But she suggested that was sort of the wrong way to look at it, that it was much closer to William Sloane Coffin's response, which is that what we see on the cross is the heart of God breaking in the suffering of humanity. And Howard Thurman said, you're not looking at somebody God killed for any reason. You're looking at the fate of love in the world. You're looking at what happens to that kind of love in the world. So I am weak theologically on divine sovereignty, and I'm very strong, I hope, on the camaraderie of the divine in the human. I think that's a Christian statement. I think I'm strong on the union of the human and the divine in weal and woe, in light and darkness, said Isaiah. So that wasn't fair, but it was really a great question. And I still have that piece. It's called Alex's Death. And it came out of Yale Divinity School's Reflections, and I still have it. And you'd have to tell me how long ago it was written, but I've it's never going in the recycle.
And Nick Walterstorff, who's one of all of our heroes, who was still a philosophical theologian, was at Yale for years. When Nick's fifth child died in the mountain climbing accident, and if you've read after Nicholas Walterstorff, he's just one of the most brilliant of men, but the quintessential work of theology for Walterstorff was Lament for a Son, that small book that with the soliloquies that he wrote in the middle of the night, kind of a grief observed like Lewis did, reflecting on the death of his son. And he quoted Coffin in that moment. And maybe you could speak to this, but Walterstorff said for him, as a philosophical theologian, in the death of his child, he saw in what we call the incarnation at least a shift in the question, the major theodicy question, because, the cliched theodicy question is, how can God be all-powerful, all-loving, and still these awful things happen to us? Walterstorff said for him there was no resolve in the death of his child or his erudite theology, but at least in Christ, the question shifted from why do we suffer to why does God suffer? And he said for him there was not full relief, but there was at least relief in that joining, that God in our suffering. And then, of course, L'Engle talks about, well, of course God is not all-powerful, because God did the most powerful thing of all in the forfeiture of power. And so are we all, is creation and the otherness of creation from God, and yet the union, are we the decision of God to forfeit power?
Woo, that's good. Did you get that on tape? Let's keep, say that one more time. See, I got you.
Are we the decision of God to forfeit power? And I mean, who's really that impressed by hoarders of power? The ultimate people who capture our imagination and our respect are those who think it not robbery to humble themselves and to forfeit. And so in Christ, maybe we see a picture of the not all-powerful God, and that is far more impressive than a hoarding God of power. That's what I read in your writings, actually.
And you got me going on a whole new list of literature of people who've lost. C.S. Lewis, Grief Observed, Rick Lisher's book on the loss of his son, Those are theological tomes, but they don't always get filed that way, right, in libraries. But they are about this topic.
I wonder, we always want our heroes, we always want to know the flesh side of them. We always, when we talk about what's lighting you up, we don't think about a North Georgia farm and a great husband and a life and all that. We think about your classroom and your books and all of that. In this season of life, what part of your joy comes from vocation and what part of your joy comes from avocation and just life on the farm? And are those two, is that like secular and sacred? Are those really not inseparable? What's really lighting you up on the backside of your life?
Oh, I like it. You just gave me part of my answer. There's really no line between the sacred and the secular. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. No, I will, first of all, Ed's back behind that fan, smart man. He and I chose intentionally to go from an urban to a rural setting. We just skipped over the suburbs because we did. He also had 2 tractors he wanted to use, and you couldn't use them in the suburbs of Atlanta. So we intentionally moved where we are. And Altar in the World, I think, talks about that move as much as anything. To get more directly to your question, I do think vocation and avocation have been woven together more tightly there, though I think I do intentionally idealize it in books, same way Garrison Keillor did Lake Wobegon. I hope there's still humanity in it, but there is a Lake Wobegon quality when I write about the farm. But there is a way in which everything in the city, including the wretched stuff, was on a human scale. It was very rare in the city, whether it was a fantastic building or the tragedy of people who had nowhere to sleep and nothing to eat. It was human scale. The first time the electricity went off for 4 days in the country, because we live at the end of a dirt road, things bumped to a different scale. It was human because I needed the electrical guys to get to my house. But all of a sudden, the well wouldn't work, and the heat wouldn't work, and the horses couldn't drink the water because the water was broken. And when I moved to the country, the sky popped up. I had a little Job experience, even around my questions about justice. Because I got a clearer notion of what was within my power and what was not in my power. I have not scripted these remarks, but it was a large shift. It is not fully made yet. I don't think I could live on the farm if I didn't get on an airplane regularly and come be with lots of people who are really, a whole different crowd than I hang out with in Habersham County. So it's not as if I still don't have a lot of choice in where I live, but Ed and I keep talking about selling it. Together, how old are we, sweetie? What's 81 plus 66? It's really old. And we keep looking at each other and saying, we really should make plans to sell this. And then we both, I think last week, just agreed it's our children's problem, right? They're just going to have to take us out in boxes, and then they can pay the taxes and figure out what to do with it. I'm not leaving, so.
I always, and I said this, ultimately when you're trying to find out what somebody thinks or what's moving them, you don't read what they write, you read who they read. How many of you were here for the last session with Brian and Frank? A lot of you stayed over. You said to me going out, which that's not the normal venue that we see you in as an academic and author, but I know those things deeply concern you and you write to them from another, angle that Frank does. But you said to me when we first were up here that was deeply moving and it was incredible. What was incredible about what Brian and Frank and Diana and the other gentlemen were saying? What moved you about that? And what's happening in our country right now in our world?
I'm taking so many notes at everything I hear here that I haven't digested, and I surely haven't digested the last hour yet. But 2 things leapt up immediately, and it was when Randall began talking about the narratives we have accepted and the more examined narratives. So that and that hooks to something Jackie Lewis said today about, or somebody said, I don't even know who said it anymore, but that great leaders tell the kinds of stories that change people, right? Or that enable other people to tell stories. So that whole idea of the way we tell the story has gotten cemented, even if it's not true. I really need to think about that. But the huge hit was the shaming piece near the end, because I completely unexpectedly shamed a nephew of mine terribly when he belittled my presidential candidate a couple years ago. And before I knew it, I had turned into a fire-breathing monster to a boy I held in my arms an hour after he was born, and watched him graduate from high school dressed like a Jedi Knight, and I just took him limb from limb, and I shamed him in a way our relationship hasn't recovered from yet. So I really want to think about that piece, the ways in which my anger turns into a wish to shame the people I'm angry with who've hurt me, and how that just keeps the cycle running. And that hooks into something Diana Butler-Bass said about how hard it is to talk about gratitude right now. So a lot of the Goose has got the spirit still making the quilt for me. But I want to listen to the scholars about the period they were talking about. I'm not the talker on that, but I'm a good listener.
All right, we have 2 minutes, and this is the worst question of all, and it simply means that I have run out of questions. So in the absence of my questions, maybe the best question of all is, what would you say to the Goose, to us who are trying desperately in the trenches to make a difference, and we're inspired by people like you, and our future work totally depends upon you saying something really good right now? But no pressure, no pressure.
We're staying at the same place. Do you know what I could do to your room by the time we get back there? It's a great question. And I started out yesterday by calling you divine goslings, and I include myself among you. I think what I see everywhere here, and that the Goose would love for me to say, is that living in faith and living in certainty are not the same thing. And that the Goose... The Goose is honking about trust and about faith and not about certainty, and about what it is to walk in the dark sometimes, and to believe that that's one of the places God does God's best work. So honk, honk, honk.